People can't make it today. Alright? Awesome. I'll just do a voice recording, so I don't need to see her. Are you ready to get started straight away?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Sure.
We'll just introduce ourselves first. So I'm Nikia. So this is Tanya, Juwag and Krishma. So we just want to say thank you again for meeting with us today. And Kat couldn't make it today. She's feeling a bit cruel today.
Right.
So with this assessment, we obviously just need to do a quick interview with you. We have some questions that we need to go through and we'll get your responses. So just one of the first ones is, what's your historical experiences of policy advocacy?
Okay, so I guess they sort of go back quite a way. I've been involved in advocacy in one form or another for quite a long time.
Yeah.
I started off studying psychology, ended up working in educational video production for a number of years for mostly Murdoch University. I did a bit for Curtin and some kind of private stuff as well.
Yeah.
I then ended up going to East Timor in 1995 while I was still occupied by Indonesia to try and make a documentary for a master's, but I ended up getting dengue fever instead and never completing that.
Oh no.
Then after that I worked in the Centre for Aboriginal Studies here at Curtin in the kind of mid to late 90s. And at the same time I was the founding convener of ANTAR, Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation in WA. So, and in that role I was doing communications and events and media support and this sort of stuff, as well as doing some work with students. So there was a little bit of a blend of advocacy in that. I then ended up being a communications manager for a cooperative research centre, which was plant-based management of dryland salinity based out of UWA. So again, part of the communication tasks with that was advocacy. I mean, part of it was kind of outreach to farmers and land managers. A whole part of it was actually outreach to other researchers, because the problem with the cooperative research centre is you have maybe, a team of 6 or 8 who are actually employed by the CRC, and the rest of your staff, we had 200 staff who were employed by other research organisations and had 30 or 60% of their time given to us. So we had a communications task just getting them on board. After that I ended up working as a policy and communications advisor for the Australian Greens. First I worked with Senator Rachel Seward over here, and I was working between here and Canberra. I then ended up working with Bob Brown and then Christine Milne as part of the Central Policy team. I finished doing that maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I've got a son who's now 22. When he finished primary school, he came to live with me for high school and I stopped doing the travel. And so since then I've been working for the West Australian Council of Social Service, which is the peak body for the community services sector. So, and the role there is between policy development and advocacy, with a bit of research thrown in. So that's very much around engaging particularly with the state government, to a lesser extent with the federal government, but also inquiries by independent institutions and so on, and basically trying to influence policy development. So, yeah, did I drift off the question? What was the original? How did I first get involved in that?
Your historical experiences of both policy advocacy. So it seems like you had a very broad experience.
Yeah. It's not what you'd think of as a career path setting out, I guess.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions. Where did that stem from?
Well, so I guess it's a combination of things. Like all the way through, I was very much interested in social influence processes and social change. That was what I started off studying in social psychology. And then I'd kind of moved into media production, but at the same time that was very much in a kind of educational and documentary sort of role.
Yeah.
but I suppose what was useful in that was it kind of helped me understand some of the principles that sit behind effective communication or effective advocacy. And so part of that is around language and communication being understood and making sure that you're actually engaging and talking in the language of the audience that you're trying to reach to. But also part of that is then around identity and influence. Like, you're more likely to be influenced by someone you can identify with and feel a rapport with. You're also more likely to be influenced by someone when you feel it's a two-way process. So if someone comes through very black and white and dogmatic and is not listening to you, then you're unlikely to be influenced. Whereas if you feel like it's a genuine dialogue and they're listening and taking on board and responding to what you're saying, you're much more likely to have an influence. And so, and that's kind of certainly true when it comes to engaging with public servants or decision makers, that it's important. I guess there's a few things there. One is that you've done your homework, so you actually understand who you're going to meet with, what their background and interests are, find out what they've said on the matter, but also then understanding what's their role and what is it they can actually do. So one of the things that we used to find frustrating when I was working with Rachel, who in fact is now my wife. That's another long story, entirely different sort of influence. But we used to get a lot of people who would come in to see us in Parliament House who would arrange a meeting to lobby us about something, and they would launch into a spiel to tell us about the issue, and we'd kind of say, yeah, okay, stop. We understand the issue. What is it that you actually want us to do? And then they'd go back to talking about the issue again without actually having thought of, well, what's our position, what's our role in the Parliament, what are the levers that we can have? So we used to spend quite a bit of time having those conversations with people, actually step back. It's great you understand the issue, but now you've got to understand how does social policy, how does governance processes work here? How is it that you actually want us to do something that's going to achieve the outcome that you want? So, and it's the same in a lot of ways, even when you're talking about individual advocacy. So, when it comes to community services, you've kind of got a combination of two approaches. There's the individual advocacy stuff, where you're working with a particular disadvantaged, vulnerable person or client, where you're helping them to understand and engage with the system to get the supports that they need. That's an interim bit. You're actually helping them to try and help themselves to work out where is it they want to get, what are their strengths, skills, aspirations that they want to build on, what are the barriers you want to help them get around. And so part of that can then be around navigating the system. And again, it's having the similar sort of understandings there. I guess the other thing that I learned working particularly in Canberra, but I guess all the way along that was really quite useful, is that when you're working in policy area, you're unlikely to be able to have the time and dig into the depth to become the expert in a particular area that you're working in. And often what you're actually having to do is, engage with 5 or 6 different areas at a time. And so often what was important was you needed to be able to quickly get a big enough grasp to understand what were the key issues. But then what became important was identifying who had the expertise and who you could kind of engage with and trust, and building relationships with them. So a big part of it was really, when it came to a critical issue coming up, who were the key thinkers and innovators in that area that you could go to and you could talk to. You'd establish a rapport with, so you could quickly jump in and cut to the chase and get their input.
So there's a lot of networking in policy advocacy.
Relationship building.
Yeah. So, and a really good example of that was around the stimulus package. because at the time that happened, so I was working advising the Greens, and I was doing kind of social policy, Indigenous affairs, natural resource management, marine, disabilities, a couple other those sort of areas. And between the global financial crisis becoming a thing and the government deciding that they needed to have some sort of stimulus package, we'd actually decided to convene a roundtable in Canberra of progressive economists and experts in financial hardship, basically to try and get a handle on who's going to be impacted worst, what is it we need to do immediately to try and do that, so we could develop policy around that. So it kind of meant we convened this meeting, and just as we're about to meet, we heard the announcement, there's going to be some sort of stimulus package that Kevin Rudd came up. So we happened to have all of the key thinkers in the room at the time that was sort of happening, and we're basically able to put together a package which had the financial counselling supports and then the stuff that ended up becoming the Jobs Fund. So that was a kind of thing where none of us had the individual expertise to do that. By getting the right people together and focused around a very specific question, which was who's going to be impacted first and the hardest, what are the things we can do straight away that are going to make the biggest sort of difference, that enabled us then to be able to develop a policy.
So do you feel being in a bigger group has a bigger influence on policy?
It depends. So you need to be part of a bigger network, but when you're actually doing the decision making and the policy design, you need to like there's sort of a critical mass, and you get too many people, and you can have too many competing ideas and interests. So part of that is what's the best size for an effective group, but part of it's also actually around who's good at doing that stuff and is going to put their ego to one side and actually engage in the problem solving. And so part of that is how you run a group like that well. But part of it's also about kind of doing the homework as well, because really you're planning for something like that makes a big difference. And being able to identify 4 or 5 people and just saying, can you put what you think are the key points and recommendations down on one page so that we can share that with people before the meeting or even at the beginning of the meeting, and have 3 or 4 or 5 people that have done that, and then be able to sit down and look at those. Suddenly you've got quite a strong starting point.
Thank you for answering that question. You've touched a bit on the second question, which is what's your current involvement with policy advocacy, and you have mentioned that you worked at the WA Council of Social Service. So I'm just kind of wondering, what's your role within your current service, and how did you get into it, and what do you do?
So my title has kind of changed slightly at the moment. I'm called Leader of Policy Development and Research. Previous to that, I was called Director of Social Policy. And the title really changed when I've also started on 2 days a week in Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, where I'm a Senior Industry Fellow, and I'm doing a PhD, which is working with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations about reducing the number of kids being taken into care. So,
linked. It's funny how you sort of economics and versus sort of advocacy as well.
Yeah. So and part of that is, like, I don't have a background in economics, but the economics component can be very important in convincing decision makers. But it's also actually a lot of the work that they do there is very much across social and economic policy. So we've done a pile of things with them around cost of living and around utility hardship, which is energy, water, those sort of things. My current role, really, we have quite a small policy team. Like, I've got one full-time policy officer, and then I've got bits and pieces of other people who are maybe attached to projects around food relief and food security, or children in the early years, or things like that. And so then basically the role is trying to kind of balance proactive and reactive stuff. So we have a pile of things that we have planned out that we do every year, and there's a bit of a cycle to those. So every year at the end of October we put out our state budget submission, which is the end of a consultation process that starts in June and July, where we go around the state, we talk to community services across the different kind of areas, you know, mental health, drug and alcohol, disabilities, aged care, children and families, you know, you name it, sort of everyone. We'll try to get around to the regions if we can find a way to do that. Often the resources are a bit tight. And from that we'll then kind of abstract up what do we think are the key kind of pressing areas of need, and what do we think are the funding priorities for services and supports to make a difference. So that's kind of a key bit. And then at, you know, early in the year, like just at the beginning of April, we do an emerging issues forum, which is something that we've developed, which is targeted specifically at the CEOs and boards of community organisations to kind of say, what are the key or emerging priorities in the sector? What's coming over the horizon? What does a longer term view look like? And what are the trends we can see around the changing face of community need? What's changing in terms of funding and regulation? You know, what are the things you need to be thinking about when you're coming to planning your services or developing your strategic plan?
Yeah.
So we do that, and a lot of that's kind of informed by the stuff that comes out of the consultation. You know, in the previous year, some of it goes to budget priorities, but then there's a pile of, you know, other issues that come up around how people are feeling around the sustainability of services, where there's growing need, where there's gaps, those sort of things. Then the next thing coming up is our analysis around the state and federal budgets. We also do a state wage case, because Western Australia at the moment is the only state that's got still got its own separate industrial relations system. So there's an overlap between federal and state responsibilities, and so anyone who's in a larger organisation, which is a constitutional corporation, comes under the federal system, but a lot of the smaller local community-based organisations and stuff will be under the state. So we do a state minimum wage case and argue around our cost of living research, which again is one of the things we do usually around kind of September, October, when the data comes out. To kind of argue around, and I suppose what's important there for us. So, you know, one of our biggest focuses is around poverty and inequality, and when we come to doing the state wage case, one of the kind of problems or gaps and concerns is actually there's only so much you can do with minimum wages when you're looking at the rate of income support through New Start, and that is so incredibly low. And so in fact it would make more sense to be considering those sort of things together. You know, looking at poverty and inequality, what are median wages looking like, what's the economy looking like, then where are minimum wages and where's income support, and what's the relationship between those. Particularly the thing that's really been changing that has been around underemployment and the growth of insecure work, what's happening with the gig economy, all of those sort of things. So I may have gone off. So going back to the role, there's a pile of those set pieces that we do, and they kind of form together and give us a bit of a policy development cycle that keeps us thinking about the big picture. There's a pile of stuff that we've got to do all along the way, which is just reactive. You know, what's going on, how do we respond to stuff? Often that's around doing submissions to particular inquiries that could be convened by a state parliamentary committee or a federal, you know, a Senate committee or something like that. So yeah, there's a kind of balance of those things, and then also there may be, we'll get funding for particular individual projects. The other stuff in my role, I increasingly then end up representing WACOS in the sector on a lot of advisory committees and boards. So, for instance, I've been doing stuff around data linkage and privacy. You know, the state's developing legislation, the Commonwealth's developing legislation. I've kind of been involved in both of those. We've also been doing a lot of work that then overlaps with my research, where we've, over the last couple of years, supported the formation of a Noongar Child Protection Council. And so we've been doing work to kind of support them in their advocacy, trying to get change in policy around funding and service design in the child protection space.
Yeah.
Similarly, we're also part of the Social Reinvestment WA Alliance, which includes Aboriginal organisations and a pile of others involved in the social justice area, which is very much around justice reinvestment and how do we, reduce the prison population, reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people, tackle juvenile justice issues, that sort of thing.
It sounds like you have to be aware of a lot of issues ongoing and also think about the future as well.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so in terms of that, what do you consider to be the key challenges facing social workers in terms of effective advocacy and also activism?
Yeah. Well, so there's a few things. I mean, one is that issue that you were raising about how do you make sure that you're aware and informed, and so part of that is just your, developing over time your networks and your news sources, and also making sure that you don't get caught in a bubble in the way that you do that, so that you're getting input from different perspectives. One of the biggest challenges when it comes to advocacy and activism is then how do you balance your work versus your personal responsibilities, because often there can be a lot of overlap, but you've got to be clear around where the line is, where your activities as an individual might impact adversely on your organisation. So, and part of that has kind of got more tricky on and off as we see governments doing stuff where they're trying to restrict advocacy by community organisations by having tied funding or tying their access to their charitable status. So we've seen a push around that in recent years with the ACNC, the Australian Charities Not-for-Profit Commission, which is the national regulatory body. It was established a few years ago, and Gary Johns was appointed as the head of that, who was someone who'd been a Conservative MP and then been running a Conservative think tank, and actually has a bit of an agenda to want to get rid of charities or stop charities from advocating and very much restrict their activities. And there's always been that tension, and so part of it is that a lot of the rules around charities go back to old English ideas around alleviating the hardness of the poor. And some of those rules are kind of quite narrow, but there's always then a recognition that if you're actually going to be effective, you can keep doing the same thing over and over, but unless you're addressing the structural issues that are sitting behind poverty and disadvantage, the support that you give people who are vulnerable may help them for a day, but it's not going to solve the underlying issues. So there's a real kind of balance and a tension between that. Part of that means you sort of need to understand what those boundaries are and what some of those laws are. Part of it also means that you then need to be thoughtful and cautious and clear when you're interacting with public servants, people in authority, around your advocacy. And so some of that is making sure that your advocacy is appropriate, that you're getting the balance right between making a strong and clear point without being kind of too confronting and adversarial. And also then being clear between your kind of public and private life. Ideally those things kind of shouldn't cross over and impact on things. One of the concerns that we've had more recently is you've seen that a pile of these pressures have kind of changed a lot of the way that a lot of community organisations and charities run in terms of both the roles of CEOs and boards, I guess, have gone from being civil society, social justice leadership to a focus more on being business managers. And you need to have a balance of both. One of the things that's a problem is that a lot of the training that people get if they want to become board members or even CEOs is often through, something like AICD, the Institute of Company Directors. And so they'll get training in corporate management and then want to apply that in a charitable space without understanding how do you balance, because if you're a charity, if you're a not-for-profit organisation, your key driving thing has to be around the mission of the organisation and how you contribute to that. And being, sustainably funded, or, sustaining your finances is important in your ability to do that, but it's not what it's about. And so sometimes that balance gets lost. We've kind of been finding in recent times a lot of people aren't necessarily willing to step up and raise these issues themselves when they're having problems with funding or program design or something like that, and coming increasingly to us to want us to advocate on their behalf to government. And that's definitely part of our role, but also we need a range of voices so it just doesn't sound like us saying the same things over and over. And often government will come back and say, well, you tell us this is a problem, but no one else is coming and telling us about this. So, yeah, I guess the other thing there is that often it's useful in a campaign or an advocacy strategy to have a range of different voices. And so sometimes there's like the insider versus outsider strategies, you'll have, and you see this quite clearly, say, in environmental organisations, you'll have some that work very closely with government around policy development and others that are out on the street mobilising people. And you kind of need the balance of both strategies, and at different points in a campaign or different points in the evolution of an issue, or depending on where government's at and the public mind is at, sometimes you need a strong external voice to be pushing something that you can't do, in a close relationship with government. But other times you need to have that relationship to actually then be able to negotiate and get the detailed arrangements into place. So, does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah. So, you have mentioned some of the challenges, and I am aware that you've sort of touched base on some of the what characterises effective policy and activism. So you've mentioned things like make sure there's clear points, and also balancing strategies, and also being aware of the public and private life. So could you touch a bit more on what sort of characterises effective policy and advocacy, if that makes sense?
Or what skills maybe?
Yeah.
Is that what skills you need to have? I kind of got a couple of them, and also that you need to offer a solution and relationship building. So what's some other skills that you need to?
So, so to start with, you need to have a good kind of situational analysis. So both an understanding around the kind of community or social need that you're trying to address. What are the underlying causes? What are the barriers? What are the voices of people with lived experience, and what are their aspirations? Where are your goals that you're trying to get to? So it's understanding the issue, but then very much understanding what are the systems and supports and rules and stuff that impact onto that, and then being able to kind of think and map through, well, if I want to address these underlying causes, or if I want to achieve those particular outcomes, what are the kind of things that I need to be addressing? So there's that part of the analysis, and then there's the part that, okay, well, who are the influencers and decision makers? Who do I need to engage with in doing this?
Okay.
So one of the things that we've done a bit of work in recent years is we developed a co-design toolkit, which you can kind of go and find on our website. We've very much been advocating around, if you're actually wanting effective solutions to particular issues and problems, then you actually need to be co-designing them with all of the kind of key stakeholders involved. And so that includes, the perspective and experience of people who are in those circumstances, and also people who have been through that journey, have experienced it and have insights into it. And then it's around, people involved in frontline services or related support services. You know, it could be like financial counselling or emergency relief around what are those supports, and then the engagement with people who are in decision-making positions and actually understand the systems that you're working with, and then sometimes that then involves, well, who do we pull in that's got some research expertise in that area that can give us some insights and things like that. So there's sort of that so there's a set of skills which is around how do you do that analysis, how do you put together those sort of issues, and part of that may be what are some frameworks I can use to kind of help guide that. There's having the facilitation skills to actually be able to bring together a group of people to work through those problems, and then, you know, also related to that is stuff around relationships and networking and building trust, and then, you know, how do you kind of negotiate things through a system. You won't necessarily always have all of those skills in any one person. And so sometimes it's then about, well, what makes a good team, you know, what makes a campaign team, what makes a good kind of advocacy service or whatever. So certainly understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, identifying people who complement you and working out how to work well with them can be really critical to that. So I guess part of that is, you know, when it comes to that, stuff around empathy and actually being a good listener is really important. Also, I guess being able to sort of maintain the balance in how you do it. So part of that is sometimes these things can be kind of personally very emotionally challenging, and sometimes you really need to be able to, you know, keep a handle on that while you're trying to sort things out, and it doesn't help if things get heated. So sometimes having some of those conflict resolution skills as well can be really important. And that's particularly tricky when you're trying to involve people with lived experience, particularly when those experiences are things that are really quite horrible and confronting. So if you're, you know, working in child protection or family violence, alcohol and drug, mental health, you're often working with people who've got very valuable experience and insights, but they've also been very much damaged and traumatised by that, and it can be really hard for them to engage around sharing their experiences without becoming overwhelmed by it and getting upset. So when you're doing that, you've got to be able to balance your responsibility to look after them, to make sure that they're okay, and you know, so doing that sort of stuff can mean, well, actually I need to call on some expert support, or I want to make sure if I'm engaging someone like that, they've got a support person, or we've discussed these issues beforehand, so we work out what do we do if things get too hard or too heavy. So I guess like a lot of those are the key skills. There's then, you know, also then there's, I guess, the communications and campaigns side of stuff, in terms of you need to then be very good at translating what you've heard, what you've learned, what you've come up with into something that's easily digested, something that's engaging, and then thinking about, you know, when it comes to, you know, any sort of campaign or strategy, often part of what you're doing is like a communication plan and stakeholder analysis, where you're actually saying, okay, what is it I want to achieve? So who do I need to influence? What do I need them to do? What sort of relationship do I have with them? What sort of relationship do I want to develop with them? And therefore, what are my communication strategies or media for those particular groups of people? So often you can sit down and map out all of those sort of things and think about, okay, there's a particular group I'm trying to mobilise through social media, and the campaigning is very much around this level, but then there's a pile of stuff where I've got to do, you know, detailed policy papers to engage decision makers in the public sector, or whatever, and then I need a digestible version with some kind of key points and stuff for the meeting with the Minister or the Director General or something.
Awesome, thank you. I think you also, you're doing our lecture for this week in social policy, and I watched it last night. I don't know if it was pre-recorded.
Okay. Right.
Maybe
Okay.
last year or something.
Yes.
Yeah, no,
Must have been, because I was just...
yeah, I watched it last night, and with like, in terms of like the writing, the actual policy paper or stuff like that, you said it, like keep it to like one page, be clear, offer solutions, and put your details like on the bottom of it. Don't put it on the second page,
make
because
sure it doesn't get
they won't
lost.
look at the second page and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So if you guys need some other skills, I don't know if we can include that, but I'll watch the lecture. Alright, thank you for that. You did kind of talk a little bit about examples of the policy that you have already been involved in. Could you maybe just give us a couple more examples of what you've been involved in of effective policy?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I'm trying to think what is some good examples.
Sorry to throw that one.
No, that's all good. One of the things that we're engaging with at the moment is with the state government around wanting them to develop a strategy for their growing the Aboriginal community controlled services sector, the ACO sector, and particularly in relation to where there are areas of disproportionate and unmet need, or where there are areas where Aboriginal people and communities aren't accessing services proportionate to their level of need. We're kind of saying where there's overrepresentation, or where they're not coming to services, there's a very clear and strong role for you to be prioritising putting services out through local community-based Aboriginal organisations, and that's particularly important when it comes to dealing with some of these tricky issues where you really need those insights and those community links to actually be able to be effective. So that, I guess, has been kind of one key area where we're starting to get some traction here now, and we're hoping we'll see things happen. At the same time, it's a place where Western Australia is behind other jurisdictions, so one of the opportunities we have there is going to look at other states and seeing how they've done things there. But there's also a balance to how you do that, because WA tends to be a bit parochial. People don't like somebody coming from somewhere else to tell them what to do, or often people are kind of reluctant to hear somebody else telling them that they know more than they know about things. And always there's also, well, you've got to be cognizant that situations are slightly different, systems work different ways, numbers are different, you've got different challenges between regional and remote versus urban areas, all of those sort of things. But that's probably a good example. We developed the first of the cost of living reports, which have probably been going about 10 years now or something like that, and that has been very effective in highlighting the impacts of poverty and inequality on particular types of households. And so kind of having done that, we've then seen most other states have adopted that model. The other causes have picked it up, and we've then seen different models being picked up and developed in research as well. Where that's been useful, what we actually do in that is we're identifying, what are some typical circumstances of different low-income, vulnerable households, and so we have like a minimum wage working family couple with 2 kids. We have a single mum, 2 kids. We have an unemployed single person in shared housing, and more recently we added an age pensioner couple, and then varied whether or not they own their own home, as a way of kind of being able to track what's changed in the cost of living from year to year, because you can never get it perfectly reflective of everyone, but by doing the same thing over, you can say, well, what's gone up, what's gone down, what are the impacts of this, where do we need to focus on policy. and you know, one of the interesting learnings that's kind of come out of all that work is around what are the real financial pressures, because often when you talk to people, what they will first say is, well, the hardest thing is actually around, you know, where people get into trouble is meeting their electricity bills, so, or their water bills, but more often their electricity bills. But actually, when you sit back and do the analysis, that's because what they have to do is they pay the rent first, so they're not homeless. Then they feed their kids. If they've got enough money, they feed themselves, and then they start dealing with the bills. It's, you know, kind of, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it's kind of so. Actually, the problem when you look at the trends over time is housing's been costing more and more. At the same time, the cost of living for essential goods and services has been going up, and the you know, when it comes to electricity bills, they've been rising, but they're also more unpredictable, so people find them hard to budget for. So that ends up being the first symptom. And so in fact, we've just sent a report out this week showing us over the last 2 years the number of disconnections in WA has doubled. So it does highlight, you know, it does kind of highlight that essential services around electricity and water and gas are increasingly unaffordable, and we've created this weird thing where they're viewed as essential services, but we've kind of privatised and marketised them in a way. But then how do we actually balance equity in how we do that? What do we do to support people that can't keep up with those? And that's one of the places that we've really fallen behind. But I suppose in doing that, you know, doing that cost of living work's been really important in that. And I suppose similarly, we've been doing a lot more stuff recently around work, particularly around insecure work and underemployment, and the relationship between that and the social security safety net. And that's particularly been one of the biggest emerging issues for us. And the other thing linked to that has been really around child poverty. So we've been pushing very strongly on that. We've also been pointing at you know, what are innovative things happening elsewhere. And so Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand has been doing a whole pile of stuff around having a poverty and wellbeing strategy that's across government. So any new you know, funding proposals that come through government, they actually need to do an analysis and say, what are the impacts this is going to have on child poverty and wellbeing? And so, you know, we've been advocating strongly about that and really kind of highlighting actually child poverty's got a lot worse in the last 2 decades in Australia, and what have been the key things in that. A lot of that's been around what's been done to the welfare system.
Can't believe how connected it all is. Like, isn't it, like listening to you talk and like, oh my gosh.
We keep being taught about all those intersectionalities and things
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that. Although you can kind of theorise them, listening to them actually being and how they interrelate and work either for the benefit or against the systems.
So I think there's a really good example there when it comes to single mothers, insecure work, and you know, kind of negotiating the social security safety net, because we actually know of all the groups on income support, single mums do the most part-time work. They go the most into work, but they also come the most out of it, and a lot of that kind of churn bouncing in and out, and that's got worse as work has become more insecure and they've had less kind of power and control around conditions there, and also as the social supports around that have got more difficult to navigate, particularly around the relationship between being able to get income support and being able to get access to affordable childcare. And so you've got this horrible interaction that happens there, that each time you bounce in and out of requiring income support, there are all of these, you know, complex systems you've got to navigate. They actually have things like a liquid asset test so that you can't have savings to make you more resilient and help you balance across when you do and don't have income. But then you can have problems between what's your pay period for work versus what's your reporting period for Centrelink, what happens when your boss tells you you're going to get one amount of money, you report that, then you get a different amount of money.
Yeah.
Or when they suddenly come up with an algorithm that gets mixed up between your tax data and your income support amount and tells you that you've got a debt from 7 years ago that you no longer have the paperwork to disprove. So there's been all of this stuff happening that actually has nothing to do with helping people improve their circumstances, get reliable work, particularly then when childcare gets harder to access. You've got to have the job before you can apply for childcare, but if you don't have the childcare, you can't apply for the job. If you don't know, you can turn up. And so you can get the job, but it's going to be 2 weeks, before you can get into childcare. There's a waiting list, you've got to go somewhere different. It gets complicated and difficult very quickly, and all of the things that we've been doing, putting up that have been around compliance, have been creating more and more barriers, making it harder and harder for people. So it's sort of a classic example, I guess, of what, sort of where you can go wrong when you start taking an punitive approach and not actually looking and understanding the lives of the people that you're dealing with, not even trying to.
I think maybe it's not in the question. I think because it reminded me something like like employment. Government tried to kind of working on the training individuals, but the more problem is it's not an individual ability. I think it's on the structure, isn't it? It's how to address it rather than.
Yeah, well. So I guess there's a combination of a few things. One is the nature of work's been changing, and it's increasingly tricky if you're low skilled and you don't have kind of the right training and experience to get secure and reliable work. So part of it is that sort of mismatch. Certainly there's a problem when you've got a system that's saying, our income support payments are only meant to be short term. We make them really hard to force you to get work, but for every one job that comes up, you've got 9 people applying for it, and the jobs that are coming up aren't the ones that you have the skills for. So
we're making 1,100 jobs a day, and we have no one to fill them. So it just depends on which
where you
discourse you're actually listening to and what's the reality.
And a lot of it is experience as well. Like they'll advertise jobs and have X amount of experience when you might not have it. So how are you supposed to get experience if they're not going to willing to give you an opportunity?
But on the flip side, they're probably thinking, you know what? There's a lot of people who would have every single bit of experience that I could ever wish for, sitting on unemployment. So the higher my criteria, the better my employee that I end up getting.
Yeah, that's true.
And part of, one of the stupid things you see there is, you've had an employment system that forces you to apply for 20 jobs each
Knowing
period.
full well that they're not even.
But if you're thinking of that from the point of view of the employer, if you actually had, your system that was, we're going to look through and find the best 5 people for you and put them in front of you, not we're going to send you 200 people who are going to be totally useless and you've got to go through those and try and find the right person. You could build, a relationship there where your employment services were working to actually do what they need to do, which is what they used to be like 20 years ago before the whole kind of privatisation and contracting.
Well, I know that with those sort of agencies, they don't, as long as they fulfil their criteria given to them by their contract, whereas we will push people to come in here and sit on the computer at least once a day, or once a week, and apply, cold call people, emails, things like that. And they know, I've even said to them, I've been in that situation, I've even said to them, so just ring people out of the phone book, any old one. She goes, yep, that'll do, as long as you're here for half a day on Friday, every Friday. So they don't even care if they're actually promoting this ability to get work. All they care about is fulfilling their contract, so they keep it.
And if you actually look there, so there's some good OECD reports recently that do comparisons, and when you're looking at Australia, we're one of the few places that have privatised employment support. Most of it is still done by the public service. We actually spend half as much per capita on supporting people to get employment. And our system is one of the tightest and most punitive, and we are very low down on levels of support we give to people. So kind of that's not a good combination.
Thank you for explaining that. So this is just the last question. So I'm thinking more broadly, what would you encourage new social workers to actively consider when engaged in policy advocacy?
All of the above?
Yeah, so I think it touched on
I just think a lot of social workers go, I'm going to get involved in social policy. It's not usually the first. But I guess like for me, the more like we learn about it or it's critical to everything because it impacts the on the floor work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I guess taking a step back, even as a social worker, you want to make sure that what you're doing is actually, you know, getting an idea of yourself, what you care about, what you like doing, what you're going to find rewarding, and you know, making sure that that's fit with the work that you're trying to do. So, and you know, when it comes to sort of social policy stuff, I don't know that you necessarily see, you know, you might start off being a bit of a policy geek and you like thinking about systems and stuff, but more often than not, people will start off because they care about issues and they're going out and they're trying to get change, and the more they get it, the more complicated things, the more barriers they come up with, and they're trying to think, well, how do I actually manage to achieve this change? You know, it's not enough, or for some people, or sometimes it's enough to go out and help one or two people, but you can be doing that for 5 or 10 years and going, and there's more people coming to me for help. You know, how do I start turning the tap off? How do I put the fence at the top of the cliff, or whatever it is that you need to do? So I guess sort of that's one of the things that will drive you to it. I guess it's sort of how you do that and maintain some kind of balance and perspective can be quite challenging. Often, you know, working around these issues can become kind of quite frustrating. You know, when you sit down there and you're thinking about things as, you know, I'm this individual trying to change this big issue, the more I look at it, the more complicated it becomes, the more barriers there are in the way and so on. So your ability to keep some perspective and balance in that is really important. You know, sometimes being able to find some space where you can get away from it, or being able to get better about recognising the impacts that you're having, being able to celebrate kind of small wins, you know, all of those sort of things are really quite important. But also, I think more often than not, it's about the people that you're working with. You know, it's actually the connection that you get with people, and that's both. I mean, sometimes that's the people you're supporting, but more often than not, it's kind of the teams and collaborations and campaigns that you're involved with, and that actually, you know, kind of going and working in this area is extremely rewarding because you meet people that really care about stuff. They're really good people at heart. It's great working with them. So, and I guess sort of, you know, one of the sort of learnings for me of going and doing stuff, you know, out in Canberra and even doing the work here was that what I knew wasn't necessarily as important as who I knew and who I could call on. And certainly, you know, developing relationships over time with people that you identified had a good heart, had a good brain, you knew you could trust them, that they were doing all that they can to have an impact in an area, and they really understood this issue. Having, you know, 3 or 4 people like that you knew and you could call on when you're dealing with an issue, and also understanding that the flip side of that is you've got to be prepared, you know, to drop things when you're called on to help out, provide support and advice and so on. I suppose also being able to, you know, understand and empathise with people who may be on the other side of the fence, you know, working as public servants or something, but, you know, they may have got there for the right reasons. They may actually really care about the stuff that they're doing, even if they're limited or frustrated by the system they're working with. And, you know, how do you navigate those relationships? How do because often then there can be things that they're constrained in doing or saying that you're not, and you can, between the lines get an understanding that, well, okay, they're working along on this issue inside, and you're trying to influence the Minister or the Director General, and they're providing all the information and support, but they actually need an external voice to come in and be pushing the Minister hard to go, oh, okay, I better go and read that stuff and think about it. So sometimes there's kind of that balance of things as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. There's a lot
Yeah,
of
that's a lot of
Good.
info. It's good though, but thank you so much for meeting with us today. We really appreciate it. I think we have a lot of stuff to go off, and I think you answered everything perfectly. So thank you so much.
Thank you for
meeting
meeting
with us today.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a good day as well.
Yeah, shall we? So one of the things that I was going to mention, we've got Sarah Madison coming over in a couple of weeks, who's a professor at UNSW. I was just thinking about that, like, we're getting her to do this round table while she's over here, which is around civil voices, because she's been a long-term researcher around civil society advocacy and so on. She's also doing a book launch while she's over here, which is for a book called The Colonial Fantasy, Why White Australia Can't Solve Black Problems. And I was just thinking that would be really interesting to get along to when it's on. And if you're looking around for people who've done interesting writing around advocacy and the role of civil society, it's worth going and looking at her work.
What was her name, sorry?
Sarah Madison. And she's at UNSW.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
I think it's 29th of April we've got the book launch.
29th.
At UWA.